welcome to the first of our new fall series or new yearly series of webinars entitled Building Sustainable Futures, Global Challenges and Possibilities. And the idea here is that we're going to be taking the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and each quarter focusing on a different one of those goals and organizing a series of wonderful talks around that goal. So for the fall quarter, our UN SDG goal is goal number 16, which for those of you who are not UN geeks, it is peace, justice, and strong institutions. And so our webinars this fall are going to focus on infrastructures to interrogate the ways in which we promote peace, justice, and strong institutions, and also how our institutions uphold violence and what we can do about that. To start us off, we're just thrilled to have Dr. Barnor Hesse with us. As we all know, in May of this year, Derek Chauvin killed George Floyd, and people across the country and around the world marched in protest, not only of Floyd's murder, but also of the institutionalized racism and that permitted that made it possible, that sanctions and excuses such state-sponsored violence over and over again. And the protests have inspired protests around the world and have also been the subject, of course, of discussions at the United Nations and the United Nations Human Rights Committee, in which for the first time the United States has been brought to task for human rights abuses in our own country. Despite foundational claims to liberty and equality as universal ideas and practices, liberal democracies are the sites and sources of continuous racial injustice, inequality, and disparities that are too often without redress. So today, we're just thrilled and very privileged to have with us Dr. Barnor Hesse, who will help us think about the role of white sovereignty in maintaining the structural law of racial rule. Dr. Hesse is Associate Professor in the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern. His research and his teaching are in the areas of Black political thought and critical race studies. He's the author of a forthcoming book, A Raceocracy, White Sovereignty and Black Life Politics. And he's the co-editor of After Ferguson, with a hashtag in front of that, After #Baltimore, The Challenge of Black Death and Black Life for Black Political Thought. So we're just thrilled to have you. Welcome, Dr. Hesse, and thank you so much. And I should say, I know there will be many questions. If you have questions, please feel free to post them in the chat, and we'll get as many of them asked to Dr. Hesse during the Q&A as we can. So welcome, Dr. Hesse, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. So the challenge I have in front of me is really to try and suggest that in all the conversations that we have about structural racism, policing, racial justice, there's a concept that we ought to use, but we're not using, which is white sovereignty. So what I'm going to try and do is to make the case for us thinking about this idea of white sovereignty as a way in which we can begin to understand many of the things that have taken place in 2020 and have in many ways have been taking place in the last 50 years. So I begin with a series of questions. They may sound rhetorical, but there is a rationale behind posing them. In US political history, who are the we in we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal? Indeed, who are the men? Who are the people in we the people? Who is the we in we abolish slavery, or we make the world safe for democracy? In Make America Great Again, for whom was America great? Who is the we in we want our country back? What is the American way of life? Who is the average or ideal American? If these sound like rhetorical questions, we should note that they are not ethnographic. They are questions about sovereignty, the occupation, ownership, and imposition of the subject position we in relation to the constituting of America, and in relation to the capacity of the we to define America and to supervise and authorize that definition. In calling this white sovereignty, the capacity to constitute and define America, I want to ask, what makes it white? For me, nothing sums up the enduring meaning and quotidian experience of what I call white sovereignty than a photograph we were about to see. If we could look at this photograph now, please. 1937, Life magazine published this immediately iconic photograph, which was taken by the photojournalist Margaret Bourke White. It has since become a defining feature of the US experience of the Great Depression during the 1930s. Entitled The Louisville Flood, the photograph was taken shortly after a major disaster in which the banks of the Ohio River burst, flooding over 70% of Louisville, Kentucky, taking close to 400 lives and leaving nearly 1 million people homeless. The picture shows a long line of African-American men, women, and children outside a flood relief agency, grimly awaiting assistance. But for the moment, I want you to look at the huge billboard above their heads. Notice how it occupies the background and foreground at the same time. The billboard was one of many produced by the National Association of Manufacturers during the 1930s that used images of modern consumerist family lifestyles to proclaim the American way of life across hundreds of cities. When we look at the billboard, the idea of the American way of life is exhibited in the dress and the comportments of an economically secure white middle-class nuclear family, and of course, their dog. Convivial, smiling, exercising control over their lives, looking forward, traveling along the highway in a gleaming automobile, all pulling together, going in the same direction, fulfilling the American dream. The banner at the top of the billboard, world's highest standard of living, urges us to see the evidence of its claim in this supersized image of the heteronormative, aspirational white family, the universal highest standard, whose success appears to be as large as their freedom. Catching our eye as we glance towards the right of the billboard is a phrase in bold, lively italics, like a neon sign, or a memorable line in a commercial jingle, repeated as a refrain. There is no way like the American way. It's almost as if the white family is singing this jingle. They are entitled to embody and convey this message. Indeed, we might hardly think of them as white if we did not remember we are viewing the billboard within the frame of Bourke White's photograph, The Louisville Flood. So if we can return to the photograph and think about what we see in that juxtaposition, in that re-signification, if you will, of the billboard through the reality of Black life. The world of the idealized white family in a secluded automobile on the highway is racially segregated from and racially antithetical to the world of individuals from Black families waiting in line. At this time, Louisville, Kentucky is Jim Crow society. Black unfreedoms are usually airbrushed out of view. In other words, there's no way like the American way can only be proclaimed here in the absence of any reference to state rights sanctioned structural racism and racial segregation. The white family supervises the meaning of freedom. The well-heeled white world above is oblivious to the under-resourced black world below, which is all too aware of what is above and behind it. In this juxtaposition, we can almost see the white family about to drive their huge automobile through a resilient line of black people as if they are not there, or maybe just to clear them out of the way, perhaps with a car radio playing. There's no way like the American way. The white family has the capacity to constitute and supervise the meaning of America, and this can be done legitimately without any reference to structural racism or Black America. The photograph reminds us who rules America through race. It captures the image of white sovereignty. Okay, we can take the photograph down. So what I want to do now is to try and think about white sovereignty conceptually. How do we put this together as an idea that has some purchase both on history and our contemporary experience? Without naming it directly, W.B. Du Bois framed the concept of white sovereignty in 1920. Writing in his book, Dark Water, he observed that Western European Christian modernity had developed a theory of colonial expansions that invariably assumed it was, and I quote, the duty of Europe to divide up the darker world and administer it for Europe's good. He argued that this normative colonial orientation unleashed the modern European discovery of personal whiteness, taking the affective form of a right to possess, administer, and regulate non-white populations. Du Bois even went as far as to describe this as a new religion, underlying the depth of its political and passionate attachment to whiteness as rule. We must bear in mind that what Du Bois calls the religion of whiteness was an unexceptional description in 1920. It had been codified since the 18th century Enlightenment. It was coterminous with the European colonial development of modernity, beginning with settler colonialism and racial slavery in the Americas from the 16th century onwards. And in 1920, when Du Bois was writing, the planet was virtually controlled by regimes that privileged whiteness. So against that kind of emergent sketch of what a concept of white sovereignty might look like, I've said a little bit about whiteness. What do I want to say about sovereignty? I'm very much aware that in political philosophy, sovereignty is generally disregarded as a useful concept. It's notoriously difficult to pin down. Virtually every proposition about sovereignty is disputed by different thinkers. These propositions range from the idea of absolute power, which is uniquely located, whether dispersed or centralized, the idea of it being the territorial delimitation of final or ultimate authority, or the idea that it specifies the distinction between legal and political sovereignty in terms of legitimate uses of power and the constitutional exercise of law. But what we find here in these myriad of different approaches to sovereignty without a prospect of tying it down to one particular definition, what we find here is a framework, a paradigm for the analysis of foundational claims to power and its enforcement. And we can begin the reconceptualization of sovereignty through this paradigm by looking at the different contextual and historical circumstances in which relations of power are being identified and analyzed with claims to foundationalism. So what I want to do is to develop a way of recuperating and operationalizing sovereignty in the term white sovereignty that becomes productive for explaining what might be described as the performative foundations of power that are not written down. This resembles what Ida B. Wells in 1900 described as the unwritten law. In fact, the unwritten law that Ida B. Wells talks about also has a resemblance to what Carl Schmitt later defined as a state of exception. For Schmitt, the decision taken to suspend constitutional law and introduce emergency powers defined what or who was the sovereign. Well, Ida B. Wells, writing earlier in the 1980s, in the 1890s, in her analysis of lynchings in the southern states of America, argued that the ritual murders of Black people were undertaken in the name of preserving democracy, a white democracy, thereby deterring Black politics from challenging the idea of white men's rule. Lynching as a performative, unwritten law was both an addendum to democracy and its presupposition. What Wells seems to be describing is what is now understood as constituent power. This is the capacity to found and posit a social order and a political order. It describes the force or the agency or the project in whom that capacity to posit is invested. Every time the US invokes the founding fathers, that is an invocation of constituent power. So let's look a little bit at this idea of constituent power and what it contributes to the understanding of white sovereignty. Carl Schmitt, in his constitutional theory, suggests an idea of constituent power that allows us to expand the idea of white sovereignty as constitution. According to Schmitt, a constitution describes a political formation or entity that is a special type of political and social order that takes the concrete form, and I quote, of supremacy and subordination, establishing a template for a special form of rule. Now, historically, what I want to call the constituent power of white sovereignty is based on the repetition of colonial racial violence. It's a repetition of colonial racial violence that takes three social forms of violence. Some of these social forms of violence are described in Achille Mbembe's book, Necropolitics. But I want to develop that idea of violence, and I want to also suggest it underpins what we would now call today racial policing. So let's look at this historically, these three forms of social violence and how they correspond to racial policing. Historically, the first form of social violence is the white settlers' foundational violence that established the right of conquest, created the space over which whiteness was exercised, and regarded itself as the sole power to judge its laws. Now, in many respects, we can understand this as the scenario that takes place each time Black people are subject to stop and frisk and are killed by the police. The second social violence is a legitimating violence, which through language externalized and imposed whiteness as the architecture of society. It converted the founding violence into an authorizing authority. In many respects, when we think about what takes place in the criminal justice system, where police officers are not charged or convicted, and Black people are disproportionately arrested, convicted, and incarcerated, we can read that as a legitimating violence. The third social violence is a reiterative violence. It's simply the violence of repetition, which is instituted to ensure the permanent authority of whiteness. It recurs again and again in the most banal and ordinary situations. If we think about that description, this is what seems to take place in everyday social situations where the presence of Black people is questioned by white citizens who call or threaten to call the police, whether it's Black citizens going into their homes, barbecuing, in coffee shops, going into hotels. So we can see in that relation between the historical constituent power of colonial racial violence and its contemporary inscriptions in racial policing, that it's broader than simply the police, and it's broader than simply institutions, and it's actually embodied, the potential and capacity for it is embodied in white citizens. This is the colonial, settler, and racial slavery history that, as constituent power, creates, establishes the foundation on which republicanism and liberalism and democracy of the US is elaborated. It's the foundation of, we hold these truths to be self-evident. It's the foundation of the 1790 naturalization law that identified only foreign-born white men as eligible for citizenship. It's the foundation of civil rights legislation in the 19th and 20th centuries conferred upon Black populations by white populations. It's the foundation of Jim Crow. It's the foundation of immigration legislation. And it's the foundation of the teaching of what is now being called patriotic history. In short, these are the foundations of white sovereignty. So how can we begin to operationalize white sovereignty in a political way, in a more empirical way? What does it mean institutionally? So here I want to say something about liberalism and democracy. But before I do, it would be useful to sort of recap what we have now available to us as a working concept of white sovereignty. What I'm describing as the foundational capacity to constitute and posit through the idea of constituent power is what is presupposed and commanded in all our social institutions, in which the organization and the distribution of resources, services, initiatives, law, presuppose, enforce, and reproduce the idea and practice of white domination and authority, and non-white subordination, and non-white assimilation. We can see this in Hollywood, universities, Congress and Senate, employment opportunities, policing, prisons, liberal democracy. What links all of those examples is a unique cultural and political position occupied by white citizenship, which is the symptomatic bearer of white sovereignty. So here I want to now sort of address this question of white citizenship and liberal democracy in two separate points. The first point will be what I describe as the liberal problem of white sovereignty. And the second will be the democracy problem of white sovereignty. So the liberal problem of white sovereignty begins to emerge in a sort of clearer outline during the Reconstruction era of US history. The problem of liberalism emerged as a problem for Black citizens vis-a-vis white citizenship. Saidiya Hartman, looking at this period of history, has described the problem facing Black citizens as one of a racially burdened individuality. And this burden for Black citizens resulted from manhood and whiteness always operating as the undisclosed but always assumed norm of liberal equality. Freedom for the emancipated former slave and enduring Black citizen meant it was one thing to be free of slavery, but quite another to be free of white jurisdiction with the federal government's Freedmen's Bureau, which regulated the mobility and labor forms in which that freedom was practiced. Black people had this white sovereignty problem in terms of their confrontation with liberalism. They occupied the status structurally of citizen and subject, equal and inferior. Liberalism obliged the Black citizen to assimilate to the universal ideals of the individual, but without any reference to the structural formation of race. Hence, white sovereignty ensures it prevails through liberalism, through what I will now describe as the discourse of the white narrative. So in a minute, I'm going to show a little video, not right now, but when I say, that will illustrate what I'm calling the discourse of the white narrative that sustains the liberalism of white sovereignty. So let me tell you what I mean by a white narrative. A white narrative, and I mean this in an institutional way, is any account, any social account, or any story of society in which one might reasonably expect issues of race, inequality, injustices to be mentioned, to be referenced in that account. But all those references to race are systematically foreclosed in ways that it seems it's almost impossible to raise these issues of race. We have a transparent white narrative. It looks universal. It looks like it represents us all as individuals because it's systematically excluded any reference to race. So the video we're going to look at, if I could just set it up, is a conversation that takes place between a number of actors back in 2012. Viola Davis is one of the actors, the only Black person in a group of white actors. And what you're going to see is the inadvertent raising of a race issue and how the white narrative suddenly goes into action to foreclose the possibility of any conversation about race by eliminating references to race and making the whole narrative white. We could start looking at that video now, please.
Tony's, how is it possible that that was your first leading role?
Well, it's politics, you know, it's just the politics of it all. You know, it's, well, yeah, I mean,
there aren't that many roles for
there just aren't a lot of roles. I mean, I'm a 46-year-old Black woman who really doesn't look like Halle Berry, and Halle Berry's having a hard time. You know, there's not a lot of leading roles.
Okay, I'm gonna have to just stop you there for a second.
Why,
That's
you
such
think I look
bullshit.
like Halle
Yes.
Berry?
No, you're hot. That is, yeah, you have to stop saying that because you're hot as shit. You look amazing.
Oh, I appreciate that, but I have an absolute understanding and awareness of the image, of course, that I project, and there's just not a lot of lead roles for women who look like me, and so that.
Do you think that's because it's African American? Do you think that's still a problem, or do you think it's improving in terms of that, in terms of like a race issue? Do you think that it's harder for African American actors?
I think that African Americans represent 12.5% of the population, and that is not the demographic that we are targeting in the movie and television industry.
And the women,
yeah,
and women.
Yeah.
I mean, honest to God, you know, this was an industry. This particular industry was made its living off of women in the 30s and 40s. You know, great. You know, Barbara Stanwyck, some great leading Catherine Hepburn. And before that,
think about,
sure.
the origins of Hollywood were really pioneered by. Look at Mary Pickford. Mary Pickford,
Sure.
and Lillian Gish,
Absolutely, and
writers like.
and so I don't believe that the audience has changed. I really don't. I think it's the opinions of the people who make the films who just decide, you know, because in general, the people who make these are the same as having spent all my time in television. The people who make these decisions always sort of aim at the lowest common denominator and think, well, the audience won't get it. I get it, but the audience won't get it.
Okay, so that's enough of that. We can stop that for now and get back to, so you can see, I don't know if you can see this, but I'm in the position of Viola Davis where I'm watching white people turn a conversation about race into a conversation about them. So it just simply means that there's no possibility now, if Viola Davis wants to sit at that table as an individual, to be part of that group with these big players in Hollywood by raising the question of race again. It has to be eliminated. That's the only way in which she can experience her individuality. And that is the problem of liberalism for Black people. It's the problem of white sovereignty. I want to say something about the democracy problem of white sovereignty. in the long tradition of Black political thought in the post-civil rights era, there's been numerous observations of the ways in which structural racial oppression or racial violence against Black people has been frequently reinforced or ignored by American democracy rather than challenged or eliminated. This reveals the democracy problem for Black citizens. Historically and conceptually, the only modern democracy imaginable and perfectible in Western modern political history and theory has been a universalized, unmarked white democracy. By unmarked, I mean it's not referred to as white democracy, but performatively it's constituted as a white privileged democracy. As the political theorist Joel Alston points out, the white citizen is the location of a valorized structural position within the white democratic polity, a racial position of equality and privilege simultaneously, equal to other white citizens, yet privileged over those who are not white. Now, while this is complicated and saturated by structural positions of class, gender, and sexuality, the occupants of white citizenship are far too often easily enamored by their life worlds within whiteness that ensure the white citizen prevails through hierarchy and segregation in resisting, and I quote, any political vision in which his or her privileges are not respected as natural rights, a normal condition, or a deserved advantage. In short, there is no structural incentive for white citizens to forego their structural domination or allow their accounts of the world to recognize structural racism. Here, white sovereignty prevails through what I call the discourse of white silencing of white sovereignty. The active refusal to acknowledge or respond to what is perceived as the questioning of structural racism through the exposure of white sovereignty. And I really want to sort of emphasize, I mean this in an institutional way that is often spoken by individuals who are representing the institution. Good illustration of this we can see in my final video. And what you're going to see here are a group of directors, once again, one Black director, Steve McQueen, Black British director, and a range of white directors. And I want you to watch how the silencing discourse operates as soon as race is invoked as a questioning of white sovereignty. If we can look at this video now.
You're all men, only one of you, Steve, is a minority. Why is that? Why is that?
I must be in America. Jesus
Why?
Christ.
I mean, why then so few women directors?
Why all black men?
Yeah. Why do you think that?
I think you did the impact.
Name one woman director who's made a major film this year.
Miranda July.
Ramsey. Lynn Ramsey. Yeah.
Okay. But you're talking about
Andrea Arnold.
You're talking about small independent films that have been very little seen in America.
Until now.
Yeah, and you're also talking about 3 or 4 people out of hundreds of films made each year. Why?
I mean, the question should be completely different. The question should be, why are there more black directors? Because there are obviously more women directors than black directors.
So what's the answer?
I have no idea. I mean, it's opportunity, isn't it? That's what it's about, opportunity. And and actors. Some people just give up because they can't be in movies. I'm always astonished by American filmmakers, particularly living in certain areas, when they never cast one person as a black person, or have never actually put them in the lead in the movie. I'm astonished. It's shameful. It's shameful. How can you be living in a country or cities in America as an actor, as a director, and not cast sort of people? I mean, I don't know. How can you live in New York and not cast sort of black actors, Latino actors? It's shameful. It's unbelievable.
Why is that?
You ask them. It's bizarre. I don't know. I mean, why? Well, you have to ask. The situation is, when there's movie reality and there's real reality, and that's kind of crazy. You know, that's what I want to do. I want to make films about what's happening in the actual reality. And I feel it's odd. I feel it's shameful, tremendously shameful. In fact.
Anybody want to explain? Take that on.
Not stepping into that.
I don't know.
Is it harder for a black director?
I don't know. Oh, no, I don't think it's harder. You have to have the opportunity. Obviously, if you have the opportunity, you just do what you want. But you have to get the opportunity, of course. But you know, that's it. I mean, you know, get on with it. You know, that's not a problem. But what we're talking about is much more important as far as portrayal of reality. You know, it's bizarre.
Because I'm not sure the video operator could hear me. So that's a classic exposition of white silencing. I'm not going to get into that, and they don't. And all of those white men sitting in that room, they're all democratically there as individual directors, have the power to decide what takes place and does not take place. And silencing is a very powerful discourse. I'm sure there's a lot of Black people watching this will recognize that. I've experienced that many times at Northwestern. It's again a very democratic reassertion of white sovereignty. So if I've made the case that I've made simply can be summed up in this way. The white sovereignty is the liberal and democratic law of racial rule that has been historically challenged by the politics of Black populations and remains the law that continues to be challenged. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Barnor, for this really challenging presentation. And as a legal scholar, a critical legal scholar, I'm really learned a lot about the ways in which the law and the culture work together here. Since this is the Buffett Institute, maybe I'll start off by asking you an international question. So you talked a lot about sovereignty in the cultural sphere, mainly domestically, although your examples obviously involved international figures as well. I'm wondering what you think about what happens to sovereignty when it transposes into the international arena. So sovereignty is the foundation of the international regime. And we now have this proliferation of so-called small states, which are mainly kind of post-colonial states, right? And which by virtue of sovereignty are theoretically equal, although we could have debates about whether that's true in practice, much like you were describing. In my research right now, focus a lot on anti-nuclear activism. And as you probably know, we're just about to get a treaty banning nuclear weapons, which has really been fought for by the small island nations and other nations which were victims of racist testing of nuclear weapons in the Pacific Islands and elsewhere. And the argument that you hear again and again is, yes, but they're just small countries. They don't really count, right? They're just the little countries. So they can ban whatever they want. They don't matter. And yet some of us still see hope in the international. So I'm just wondering what you think. Is this the same thing transposed elsewhere, or are there any possibilities when you take the concept outside of the domestic and into the international space for change?
Well, the concept is already in the global space. I took a number of different decisions as to how to present this today, and it seemed to me if you can make the case in America, then you can go and make the case somewhere else. So, I mean, if we're thinking about white sovereignty, we should be thinking about the foundations of the United Nations. So if you think about, say, you know, some of the discussions that are taking place at Dumbarton Oaks during the war, these are discussions that want to set up a more successful institution than the League of Nations, and one that can bring together those superpowers, although the term wasn't used in those days, to keep the peace. Now, this idea of keeping the peace had always been the responsibility of Western powers. There's no initial conversation about the end of colonialism or Jim Crow. This is not on the agenda. What places this on the agenda is the United Nations Assembly, once it begins to be filled up with newly independent states. So I guess what I'm trying to get at is that between the establishment of the United Nations and the fully formalized colonial world, there doesn't really seem to have been a handoff from white sovereignty into a more democratic sovereignty. It's one of the reasons why the West can be invoked in a lot of political discourses under the phrase, what does this mean for the West? What does the West think? The West will decide who has nuclear weapons and who doesn't. There really hasn't been a shift from white sovereignty. You can also see this in immigration. The immigration problems are generally the problems that are borne by non-white travelers, non-white people, non-white labor. So immigration, again, if you even look at that historically, you see it emerges as a mechanism for managing the mobility of non-whites. So what I'm trying to get at is the kind of shadow white sovereignty as a structure which is behind the formal representation and recognition of questions of sovereignty.
One of the viewers who says, if Jim Crow and immigration legislation and so on are the structural institutions of US-based white sovereignty, what do you see as the structural institutions of global white sovereignty? Oh, we can't hear you. Oops.
I didn't say that. I wouldn't say that Jim Crow and immigration are the structural basis of white sovereignty. If anything, liberalism and democracy is the basis, structural basis of white sovereignty.
Interesting.
And if you think about it, Jim Crow society didn't claim not to be a democratic society, and Jim Crow society emerged through the democratic framework of states' rights. Okay, so so by the same token, globally, white sovereignty, this is what I'm really trying to illustrate, works through liberal democratic institutions.
Thank you. So we have another question about Native American sovereignty. Where does the subjugation or thinning out of Native American sovereignty in the United States fit into your conceptualization of white sovereignty?
Well, simply by virtue of the fact that white sovereignty is a project that eliminates not only all other claims, but itself to the occupation of land over which it administers control, but it also exerts claims to the bodies of non-whites, to the languages, to the history. So what you find with white sovereignty is a liquidation of any other form of possibility of sovereignties in the space that it occupies. And I think that's the history of indigenous Native Americans across the Americas.
So then the next question follows from that. One of our listeners asks, is the concept of sovereignty itself the problem then? Do we need to get rid of it, or can it be reimagined somehow?
Well, what I try to point out is that the problem isn't the concept of sovereignty. The problem is the concept of not acknowledging white sovereignty. White sovereignty works in a performative way, in an unwritten way, in a way that secures the ground upon which we place our liberal and democratic institutions. So if you were to think about this in a very empirical way, well, white sovereignty is what underpins the claiming of the United States of these lands. Getting rid of the concept of sovereignty doesn't get rid of the claiming of the United States of these lands to be run under the jurisdiction of, white populations, or let me give you another example. So if you take something like the idea of racism as a bad thing, and you trace that historically, its lineage, emerging as a 20th century concept, one of the things that we find from the 1930s onwards, particularly with the rise of Nazi Germany and the Allies, Britain, France, the US, going to war against the racism of Nazi Germany, is that we find that the very idea of problematizing race that emerges in the West, that's named racism, is a problematization of what Nazi Germany is doing. In fact, the concept of racism operates and emerges under the jurisdiction of white sovereignty. So World War II can be fought as a war against racism, but none of the allies were fighting against what you might describe as racism of colonialism or racism of Jim Crow. That was not something that was problematic racially. So we are then left with a concept of racism that associates it with right-wing, extreme right-wing organizations and mobilizations, nothing to do with liberal democracy. We leave to one side, the Nazis copied a lot of their developments, policies, eugenics, empire from Britain and the US. And it leaves populations facing the racism of liberal democracies, trying to fit their experiences into a concept that's been constructed by white sovereignty. It's one of the reasons why you hear supplements to racism through institutional racism or anti-Black racism, because that historical indictment of race is insufficient to capture the experiences that Black populations, non-white populations have had under liberal democracy.
That's great. So then maybe we could ask the same question that the listener asked about sovereignty, about liberal democracy. Is it your position that liberal democracy itself really needs to be replaced with something else? Or do you think that there are ways in which it should be reimagined?
Well, I think if you want to reimagine any institution, then if the diagnosis is the institution is based in the sort of foundational capacities of a chosen people, then one has to reimagine that reflex to institute a chosen people. And that then opens the possibility for the discussion of what kinds of institutions. The problem is that liberalism and democracy, are problematic to the extent that they incarnate a form of whiteness as its base. Now, we haven't even got to the point where we can have that conversation. Why is it certain people can say we want our country back? Native Americans can't say that. White citizens can say that. How is that possible? Right? So the problem is the very institutions prevent us from having that kind of conversation.
So the next question is from Owen Brown. It says, I was wondering about the relationship between the concepts of constituent power and sovereignty and order. Could we say that the three forms of colonial racial violence that you spoke of are also ordering violences?
Yeah, the three forms of violence actually comprise constituent power. Okay, it's part of trying to get at the myth that successful societies tell themselves, which is a valuable liberal democracy in its history tries to tell itself that it's established itself through liberal democracy, but it didn't. It established itself through violence. And that violence then becomes hidden, and we create myths about that. So that's a constituent power. That's one of the reasons why there can be a resort to violence, say in this country, where white militias can walk the streets protected by the police, and Black people with guns would actually be the object of policing. This is not idiosyncratic behavior. This is the expression of white sovereignty.
Yeah, and maybe just on that point, sorry, just to follow up, I wonder if, what you're saying is so, in a sense, obviously true. Like, you're describing a fact in our world, which is just so apparent. You don't have to go digging for these examples. They're like right out there for everyone to see. The video you showed, so do you ever feel as a critical scholar that you actually have a strange rhetorical challenge of talking about the self-evident as opposed to, so much of our critical work is trying to dig up the hidden sources of things, but this is right there on the surface and yet is being ignored, and our critical faculties are not terribly great at revealing that sort of issue. I don't know what you think about that.
Well, I'm actually convinced that things are intrinsically self-evident. I mean, many things become self-evident once they've been pointed out. But I've seen the kinds of things I describe systematically ignored, repressed by Western scholarship for hundreds of years, even though there might be examples in the scholarship where it's evident. It takes a particular discourse or framework of analysis to make something evident. And then the question is, in the politics of scholarship, will that evidence be made available or will it be repressed?
Yeah. Okay, Penelope Deutscher asks, could you say more about the role of burdened individuality in Hartman in his work? Do you agree that one way of understanding sovereignty is the relationship between different forms of power, particularly when some seem outmoded but persist?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think understanding the relationship between different forms of power and the sort of hegemonic project under which they operate is one way of thinking about sovereignty. But, there are other ways of talking about sovereignty. What I was trying to get at is we can't really settle on which is the way to locate, the ultimate source of power. That's the formal way of talking about it. What interested me in thinking in terms of constituent power is that we're looking at the exercise of power performatively rather than that which works through a discourse that represents it. Looking at stuff which is unwritten, stuff which is done, the kind of colonial underpinnings that were being done in terms of values and meanings, while liberalism is being written down, which facilitate the possibility of liberalism going global. On the question of burdened individuality, what Saidiya Hartman is trying to get at is that the idea of assuming individualism or individualhood requires that you assimilate to a profile and a template that's exhibited by the white citizen. The white citizen is oblivious to questions of race, white supremacy, and so on. The white citizen sees universality and transparent equality, where the Black citizen is burdened with having to navigate their claims to individuality through structural racism, through experiences of racial policing. The only way to be an individual is to deny the experiences of structural racism and to deny the experiences of racial policing.
So we have a question about the concept of law and order in the current political debate, and wondering how you see the concept of racial rule and white sovereignty working relation to this national call for law and order in our popular discourse.
Well, the discourse of law and order historically is specifically racialized around what was known in the 19th century as the Negro problem. So if you're looking at the emancipation of Black populations in the 19th century, the mobility of Black populations became a cause of concern and moral panic for white citizens. Much of the early forms of policing coming out of slavery and into the post-slavery moment were developed around trying to police the movement of Black populations who were required to stay in place for work in the early days, where the Freedmen's Bureau required people to have an identified location and be available for work. And what you see getting into the 20th century is the idea that on the one hand, Black people can be out of place, and then on the other hand, Black people can represent a problem to the order of society through the mobilizations of politics and dissent. Getting into the later 20th century, Black people are mobilized in the white imaginary as representing a crime problem. So law and order has always been racially coded. And it's always been racially coded as an appeal to the white citizens who have the power to define the outcome of America.
Incredible answer. We could have a talk on that in itself. So perhaps the last question, one of our viewers asks about the shifting boundaries of whiteness, about who counts as white being different at different moments with certain categories of people, Muslims, Arabs, Asians, and so on, Irish Catholics, Jews being included or not included at particular times. How does this question of the shifting boundaries of who is white figure into your analysis of white sovereignty?
Well, we could play the game of musical chairs. I think the question really is, how is it that the chairs get to be there and who's moving the chairs rather than who gets to sit in the chairs? Whiteness is a structural feature of this society. So if, for example, you have a structural feature of US society in which the presidency is usually occupied by a white person, and the presidency is usually symbolic of white sovereignty. What it means is that when Barack Obama occupies that white position, he is compelled to operate in such a way that reproduces the sovereignty of white sovereignty of the US. So I'll just give you one example. If Barack Obama is the president of the US and he wants to tell a story about the US that represents the US, he has to say the US was born in freedom and it's been an ever-growing, evolving form of freedom. He has to insert, the Pilgrim Fathers. He has to tell a story of America that corresponds to a white citizen vision and then fit other people around it. So when you have the changing conceptions of who is white and who isn't white, that's simply trying to reassign people to positions within the structure of whiteness. You had it in the very early 20th century when some people from India found themselves being redefined as non-white and then going to court and being redefined as white. But it didn't change the system in which being on the side of whiteness or non-whiteness really determines your life. It's the structural foundation of whiteness, which is the issue, not who gets to find themselves as white or not white.
And that is, I think, a nice segue into more to come at Northwestern Buffett from Dr. Hesse. We are really looking forward to your talk in November together with Dr. Salman Saeed from the University of Leeds on the governance of Islamophobia, which may address some of these questions as well. And again in December with colleagues at McGill on the nature of the state. And also through our Meridian 180 discussion series, we're going to have the pleasure of your leadership of a discussion on racial policing. So very, very grateful for all the thought leadership that you're providing this quarter at Northwestern Buffett. And thank you for a wonderful talk. And thank you all for joining us today. We'll be sending you a survey. I encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list. And our next event in this series will be Tuesday, October 20th at 12 p.m. Central Time, and it will feature Associate Professor in Residence of Anthropology and Acting Director of the Liberal Arts Program at Northwestern University in Qatar, Sami Hermez, who's going to be talking about identifying, naming, and understanding violence in its various forms.